The Heritage Center Foundation has found that the respondents in the photo identification and non-photo identification states are just as likely to report voting compared to respondents from the states that require voters to state their name. The same with respect to African American respondents with respect to photo identification. There is an issue, and one of the interesting things that came out today, so many Democrats conceded that there was fraud on a grand scale in some cases with respect to voter registration. Now, if there is fraud with respect to voter registration, it certainly is not a far jump to believe that there is fraud with respect to in-person voting. And I'm glad they pointed that out, and hopefully they'll be on board when we do the rest of the voter reform legislation, which will address issues such as the fraud in the registration process. We had a number of witnesses, and they were very, very clear that this is necessary to combat voter fraud, and it's absolutely necessary to combat the perception of voter fraud. It is imperative that we have clarification and confidence in our electoral process. And a lot of the cases, some of them going on right now, have stressed the need for equality and equal protection in all of our electoral endeavors. There was some talk, for example, about the college ID issue. And there were all kinds of hypotheticals stretched way out to the nth degree as to someone who might be disenfranchised. I don't know the exact number, but there's probably over 100,000 or more college students right now who are at our private universities, Xavier University, Dayton University, Wittenberg University, Hiram College, across the board, who currently aren't on a level playing field with respect to those students attending our public universities. And our goal is to, quite frankly, get them on a level playing field. We want everybody to be on a level playing field. Hence, the indigency addition to the bill, if you will. Very simple process. The state is already geared up to do the photo identification. They do it at the Board of Elections. And with respect to the people who can't afford it, take a trip to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles and you get it done. Representative Huffman had a good amendment dealing with the fact that you can use expired driver's licenses. There's no time limit on that. And that would help some of the elderly, perhaps getting up in the 85-year age and above, who may have the expired driver's license around and would still be permitted to vote. Let's remember one thing too. You can always vote absentee exactly the same way you can right now. That's imperative to note. So you've always got that opportunity to do that. People are encouraged to do that, and we will continue to do that. Part of the goal here is to clean up ambiguities and problems prior to the day of the election so that there aren't a raft of provisional ballots and tough decisions that have to be made by very overworked poll workers. And we clean these issues up by requiring 4 simple identifications. And a lot of these problems are then eliminated at the day of election. And that's where the majority of the lawsuits have occurred recently with respect to day of election voting in Hamilton County and what provisionals get counted and what don't get counted. So that's one of the goals, and it's going to be an overarching goal as we address the rest of the electoral reform process. So thanks a lot for hearing us out on this issue.
Any questions?
Mr. Speaker, I talked to Jane Flatman of the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections this morning, and I asked her about this impersonating a voter. She said, in terms of someone going to a polling location and impersonating someone else, I have never seen it. It's never been brought to my attention that it has ever happened in Cuyahoga County. What evidence do you have that this is an issue anywhere in Ohio?
Well, I think there are a lot of people that haven't seen a lot of things going on in Cuyahoga County. That's why about 60 people are under indictments. I think that has to be one of the silliest things I ever heard of. How could anyone say with any certainty that they had never had any votes cast using someone else's name. What planet's she on?
I think what she's saying is that there's no one that's been prosecuted for that.
Oh.
There's been no cases referred to, you know, any
Yeah, I understand.
prosecutors.
No, I understand. Nobody's been prosecuted for a lot of things up there for a very long time.
Second of
Doesn't
all,
surprise me.
how would you know? Maybe you have 1,000 people
Oh,
come
yeah.
without a photo ID. How would you
don't.
know?
You don't.
Mr. Mecklenburg, Mr. Blessing, there were a lot of cases cited about voter registration fraud, as you pointed out. Those cases seem to be easier to identify. Is the problem in the lack of examples because it's hard to tell if someone impersonated someone else? You said of one case, but do you think there are thousands of this happening in Ohio we don't know about?
Look, let's first point out that the other Board of Elections persons from Cuyahoga County testified in committee that this was very, very necessary to guard against that particular issue. The answer is, do I believe it happens? Yes, I do believe it happens. It's proving a negative. It's impossible to prove a negative. In other words, how do you prove fraud doesn't exist there? That is the problem with it. In Hamilton County Director Amy Searcy, I quoted her on the floor saying, all it means is that she, Amy Searcy, at one given point in time, can't necessarily identify it. We all know that the passions that are in recent elections have inspired. And we've got situations, for example, in Hamilton County where they take kids out of public school, public high school, bus them down to vote early, give them Democratic sample ballots only, and then try to pawn it off as a field trip. Now, if this kind of stuff is going on, I believe that that type of stuff is going on all the way through the electoral process, from the registration up through the final counting. And we intend to do a complete overhaul of that. What gets lost in the translation is that voter dilution is every bit as important as voter enfranchisement. And this bill helps address voter dilution, as will a lot of the other initiatives we'll have.
Why now? Why so fast with this bill? I mean,
It wasn't
everything's
fast.
happening in
It wasn't fast. Let's get real
You
here.
had 2 hearings, right?
We had 2 hearings. We had 6 hours of debate. We had another 3 hours on the floor today. You tell me the Democratic Party didn't have the opportunity to put forth their positions on this bill? They most certainly did. We brought their witnesses in from Washington and St. Louis to testify via Skype. They had every opportunity to present their full position on this matter. And if you listen to them on the floor today, the vast majority of what they said was repetition of the same thing over and over and over again.
So the question is, why did you have to move it in just 2 hearings? I understand your point about the testimony, but 2 hearings is still only 2 hearings, and it did move quickly from introduction through.
2 hearings is 2 hearings. It moved with dispatch, is the way I would look at it. And I would also say that we're going to be undertaking so many different election-related issues. And if you followed how it went last time, when you start getting into all these other election issues, you can get lost in the brush out there so many different ways. And the idea was to clear this one out of the way and then get down to the other matters, which are going to obviously take so many different issues. I mean, you can get into a debate about where the flags go on election day that can last as long as 6 hours or more. So, we got a lot on our plates. And once the testimony is heard once, twice, 3 times, do you really need to hear it a 4th, 5th, or 6th, or 7th time? We must be, I think, very cognizant of the amount of time we have to spend on issues when it's repeating the same thing over and over again.
Could you expand on why it was important to do this particular piece right now?
Sure, I think I get where you're coming from there. I believe that this is a cornerstone of good, solid electoral reform, that you build backwards from the date of actual casting of the ballot. And that is still where 80–90% of the people vote. Over 90% of them or more are voting with a photo ID already. You build backwards from that, and you make it sound where most of the people are already voting. You make a sound, solid decision that treats everybody equally, and then you work in other directions with respect to the voter issues, and that's why we approached it in this fashion.
Did you have any concerns that this provision might be more prone to attract court challenges than some of the other things that might be in the broader bill? Did you want to keep this separate?
No, I think the Dems will file suit over everything involving elections. Their mission in life is to keep the electoral process as confusing and as complicated as possible. Because when you have that many different avenues that you could travel down to file lawsuits, by gosh, there's a bunch of lawyers out there that will do it. So no, there was nothing that this would spur more litigation than anything else, because there's already a lot of litigation, and there always will be election-related issues.
Mr. Speaker, do you think there's going to be any costs associated with this bill for poll worker training or voter education, you know, if this was to come along?
Those two areas are covered by present law. That is, people who are going to work at the polls are required to go to the class. The class has gotten longer in recent years, but that'll be no different than it has been. So far as educating voters, obviously we have all kinds of material that goes out to educate voters. Where do you register? How do you undertake the right to vote by absentee? All that stuff is on brochures that are prepared and printed by the Secretary of State. So I don't think there's any additional cost, but of course there's always cost to running elections.
Mr. Speaker, your caucus has no African-American members, and there was a lot of comments from African-American members in the Democratic caucus who related to this to real-life experiences in their own families. Do you think that they are unnecessarily fearful about this, or do you think it was insincere on their part? There was some very passionate comments about this, and what could you do to reassure them that wasn't your goal?
I was a little bit embarrassed by the floor debate today. The suggestion that no one is being accused of being racist, which began, but therefore we have these problems, that began the debate. Later on, it was sort of as if there was a concatenation within the Republican Party to do something racist. And I don't think that that is fair in any way, shape, or form. I'm always amused when I hear the Democrat leadership say, well, you don't have any blacks in your caucus. They beat the heck out of the last one we had in 1972 in Dayton, Ohio. I'm still mad about it. He ran in the relay with Jesse Owens at the 1936 Olympics. He was a great guy. They spent a heck of a lot of money to get rid of him. Obviously, we go out and recruit. And when we do that, we try to get black candidates. You might ask the speaker if he had an opponent last time, what color he was. I think it's important that we not have that kind of discussion on the floor of the House. There's enough feeling in communities, black and white, about race, that we don't need to have people stand up on the floor of the House of Representatives and act as if everything that's going on is racist. And particularly not from the party that gave fewer votes to the 1964 Civil Rights Act than the Republican Party. And particularly not where you have an effort every time there's an election challenge to not count the soldier ballots. It just seems to me that if people want to get up and throw bricks at each other, there are possibilities there always. I don't think it's appropriate. I understand that many people feel very, very strongly about it. That I understand. On the other hand, that is the floor of the House.
Mr. Speaker, one of the Democratic arguments here seems to be that the motivation behind the bill was really to limit votes from constituencies that tend to support Democrats, African Americans, the elderly, whatnot, for either one, to gain an advantage in the presidential election next year, or perhaps this fall if the referendum on SB 5 makes it to the ballot. Could you just speak to that? Was there any political motivation here?
None whatsoever. I know all the members of this House, some a lot better than others, but I can tell you that obviously within our caucus, and I've talked to everybody, I recruited the people that ran, there is none of that. We have a number of people who could tell you stories about their relationships in the military and so forth. We have quite a few soldiers on our side of the aisle, pardon me, and a Marine. I think it's important for us to avoid that kind of discussion unless they really believe that that's what the motivation is. What always amuses me is when they start out by saying, we don't believe that this is what's going on here, and then zoom, they hone in on that issue. There are a lot of reasons why someone could have opposed this bill or favored it. I would never say that the black members of our House opposed this bill on racist grounds.